Welcome! Today, we're jumping into France's ambitious and often brutal quest to build an empire in North America. We're going to explore how a mix of royal ambition, a hunger for resources, and just the sheer grit of ordinary people managed to forge a whole new society an ocean away from home.
So, here's our roadmap. We'll start with why they even wanted to go in the first place, the dream. Then we'll cover the first, pretty dangerous attempts at a settlement. After that, we'll see how Quebec became the key, the anchor for everything. We'll track how the colony grew, and finally, we'll look at the legacy of it all, which, believe me, still shapes our world today.
So, first things first, you have to ask, what would possibly motivate people to cross a treacherous ocean to a world they knew almost nothing about? Let's take a look at the powerful forces that were driving this North American dream.
And you know, that simple question has two very different answers. It really depends on whether you are the one wearing the crown or the one holding the farmer's tools. It wasn't just one single dream, but a whole collection of hopes and ambitions, all pointed toward the very same spot on the map.
Okay, before we go any further, let's get one key term down: New France. This was the name for the huge, sprawling territories in North America that the French crown laid claim to. It was their grand vision of a French empire in the so-called New World.
And this is where it gets really interesting. You've got these two very different forces pushing in the same direction. For the king, it was like a giant chessboard. A colony meant more power, more prestige, and in a way to get rich off resources to one-up rivals like England and Spain. But for the actual settlers making that dangerous trip, the dream was way more personal. It was the chance to own their own piece of land, to build a better life, something that was just impossible for most of them back in Europe.
All right, so with these big ambitions pushing him forward, France makes its first real go of it. They try to establish a settlement in a region they called Acadia, and this was their first true test of survival. The lessons they learned here were going to be incredibly harsh, but also really valuable.
Now, you got to understand, they didn't just throw a dart at a map. Acadia was chosen for a reason. It was a strategic key. If you could control it, you controlled the coastline, and you had access to the unbelievably rich North Atlantic fishing grounds. And at the time, fish was like gold. Holding Acadia meant you had a gateway to the entire continent.
But look, a great location means nothing if you can't actually survive there. And their first two tries show this brutal learning curve. The first one, on Isle de St. Croix. That first winter was just awful. Scurvy, a nasty disease you get from a lack of vitamin C, wiped out about half of them. They had to abandon it. The next attempt, Port Royal, went a lot better. But then politics from back home got in the way. The king took away the fur trade monopoly that was funding the whole thing. No money, no colony. They had to pack it up again.
But the story of Acadia doesn't just end there. Not at all. Years later, after a community did finally manage to put down roots, their story takes a really tragic turn. This time, it wasn't about surviving the winter, it was about being caught between two giant warring empires.
So eventually, the British took control of the region, and they put the French-speaking Acadians in an impossible spot. Swear a binding oath of loyalty to the British king or lose everything. The Acadians refused. The result was just brutal and swift, an ethnic cleansing known as the Great Upheaval. Thousands were forcibly deported, literally torn from their homes, and their families were scattered all across the continent. It's a foundational tragedy in North American history.
So, after the incredibly hard lessons of Acadia, a visionary named Samuel de Champlain enters the picture. He realized that for New France to survive, it couldn't just be a settlement. No, it had to be a fortress, and he knew exactly where to build it.
For Champlain, the entire future of New France really boiled down to one critical thing: picking the absolute perfect spot. It had to be easy to defend, it had to control access to the heart of the continent, and it had to be a great hub for trade. And Quebec, well, it was a stroke of genius. It ticked every single box. The St. Lawrence River gets really narrow there, creating a natural choke point. You could control every ship that went by. The huge cliffs made for a natural fortress that was easy to defend. And its location was perfect to become the central hub for the incredibly lucrative fur trade. It was simply the perfect spot.
But Champlain was smarter than just picking a good spot on a map. He knew you couldn't survive here alone. His strategy was also about people. He understood that building strong alliances with the local First Nations was absolutely essential, not just for the fur trade, but for basic survival. These partnerships provided fur, sure, but also critical knowledge of the land, new technologies like the canoe and snowshoes, and even military support. They were the key to everything.
Okay, so with Quebec established as this solid anchor,
The colony of New France finally starts to put down some deeper roots. It begins to expand. It's not just a fragile little outpost anymore, it's the beginning of a real French society in the Americas.
And you can see that growth right here. We've got that early, ill-fated attempt at Port Royal in Acadia. Then, just a few years later, the game-changing founding of Quebec. And from there, the expansion continues up the St. Lawrence River to another key spot.
And that next major settlement was Ville-Marie, the city we now know as Montreal. Founded in 1642 by a really devout group, it didn't actually start as a trading post. Its purpose was religious. It was intended to be a kind of model Christian community in the wilderness. But its location was just too good. Being on an island in the middle of the river meant it was destined to become a vital hub for trade and expansion deeper into the continent.
All right, let's pull back now and look at the big picture. Let's connect all these historical events to the impact they still have today, because these early struggles and decisions, they didn't just vanish into history. They laid a foundation that we can still see and feel all around us. So when you boil it all down, the survival of New France really rested on three main pillars. First, smart geography, picking spots like Quebec. Second, a powerful economic engine, and that was the fur trade. And third, those crucial alliances with First Nations. You take away any one of those three legs of the stool and the whole thing probably would have collapsed, just like those first attempts in Acadia. And that's really the final takeaway here. The story of New France isn't just some dusty old history. It's the prologue to a story that's still unfolding right now. The borders on our maps, the languages we speak, the cultures that exist today, they all have deep, deep roots in this early, uncertain, and incredibly important foothold in a new world.